Was supposed to be talking about UFOs again today, but I decided to uh, jump into something that's a little more topical. That's topical too, but uh, this is a rare call to action that I'll put out. Uh, right now, we have an issue with that they have called up approximately 3,000 reservists, or at least they've given authorization to call them up. Whether they've been called up or not exactly at this point, I don't know. I see this as a huge problem, and I think people really need to start drawing the line with Congress and letting them know that this escalation we're doing in Ukraine needs to come to a halt, and that we need to be uh, working on de escalating this problem. Now, in all likelihood, my guess would be is the reason why they're doing this initial call up uh, is the 80,000 troops over in Europe right now are probably overtaxed with supporting Ukraine. Uh, it's pretty much an unadmitted fact that we have special forces on the ground there. Uh, we are providing intelligence, we are providing equipment. So that means the military that's in Europe is very busy with preparing equipment for shipment, shipping it over to the border, possibly even bringing it across the border to the Ukrainian military. They're providing training. They're probably doing repairs and maintenance. Uh, and also, would if the M1s start flowing, guarantee that we're going to be setting up maintenance depots probably close to the Ukrainian border. We're providing a huge intelligence support effort, which requires a lot of action. So my guess is that the existing troops there are probably at the point where they're getting overworked and they're basically trying to give them a little bit of relief with extra help, or that it seems like the Ukrainian offensive seems to be stalling. And so these reservists are probably there to help keep up the tempo of things. Now, I know some people are saying, well, yeah, we need to help the Ukrainians. Well, I'm going to throw out some ideas here. Hopefully, you'll reconsider your position a little bit. One of the things I'm very concerned with that, in addition to actually helping existing operations, that this may be a bit of a trial balloon, whereas the Biden administration is looking to see if there's any reaction to the call up of reservists, and I want there to be one. I want it to be negative. In support of that idea, I have three links in the comment section. The first one is a story from Daily Wire, basically talking about the fact that this is really happening. It's not something that's just rumored going around on the internet. The other thing is I've included links to contacting your congressman. It's really, really easy to do. You click on the link, you give them your location information so they can give you the email addresses to your representative, and you just do a really simple message saying, I am opposed to the activization of the reserves. Uh, Hopefully, you're also opposed to weapon shipments and a call for immediate negotiations to basically try to defuse this thing. Now, one of the things that kind of gets overlooked by a lot of people is that when they activate reserves, a lot of times they are grabbing people who are on the verge of the end of their commitment to the military. So, in addition to just sending people over there who probably weren't planning on going over there, you're upending some of these guys' lives. I'll give you a good example of one I was getting out. 8 months before I retired, I started up the first business that I'd be doing after I got out. And I spent that 8 months ramping the business up, getting all the advertising in place. And I actually hired a friend to essentially work the business until I could step into it coming out. So you got these people who are planning on starting families, planning on going to college, planning on starting a business. Maybe they have a job that they're ready to walk into, and they're going to get yanked out to essentially go allow a bunch of neocon chest thumpers to get their way over in Ukraine. So even if you're, let's say you're saying, well, geez, yeah, I feel bad for these guys, but it's, Ukraine, they got attacked by the Russians. It's really bad. And, we got to support them. We got to help them. So I want to talk a little bit about our track record around the world, essentially the intellectual giants who've created our foreign policy since World War II. In Vietnam, in the waning days of the World War II, our OSI, the predecessor to the CIA, ran across the great Ho Chi Minh, who was a guerrilla fighting the Japanese, and they touted this guy as the greatest guy in the world. He's their hope for the future of Vietnam. Essentially, he was on the verge of death. Our OSI gave him, I believe, was anti-malarial drugs and brought him back from the brink, and we armed and trained these guys. Once the Cold War had started, we had had a policy that we would never, ever, under any circumstance, help a former colonial power recolonize their colonies. We broke that rule during the Korean War. We decided we wanted to put a little extra pressure on the Chinese, so we reversed our policy and we armed the French and gave them transport ships so that they could reoccupy French Indochina, which is part of Vietnam. And once their little war was full in swing and our war in Korea was over, we left the French hanging at Dien Bien Phu. They had requested assistance. We were working on some kind of assistance package, and the great intellects of the time decided that the smartest thing to do was let the French get beat. And then once it was all over, then the French were essentially willing to try to help us set up some kind of post-Vietnam government, but we pushed them out as quickly as possible. So got rid of a army that was well trained and able to handle the situation, and we decided the smartest thing to do was put the Catholic minority in charge of the country. Nothing against Catholics, just pointing out that we basically put a minority in, thinking that this would create the situation that would grant the greatest stability to us, creating a essentially a anti-communist outpost. And history is pretty much straightforward on how that all worked out in terms of Vietnam. It created nonstop instability to the point where we essentially had to take over the entirety of the war. And once we did, we were incapable of bringing it to any kind of fruition in terms of a victory. Okay, well, what about Iran? Well, we decided Iran had a democratically elected government in the 1950s, and we decided the smart thing to do was let's overthrow that government, and the CIA is out and out admitted to this, and we'll put their old king, technically the Shah, back in power, even though there's no popular desire for it. Then once that government reached a point of instability to where it was having problems, we heard of this great guy called the Ayatollah Khomeini, and we said, well, gee, he's anti-communist, so we'll just let him take over, and we'll be friendly with them, and we'll have a good ally there as an anti-Russian. That didn't work out too good either, did it? So let's talk about Afghanistan. So the Russians came in, and if we look at some of the stuff that was going on, there essentially was government instability in the late 70s. A lot of it fostered by the CIA. When the communist government attempted to take over, which wasn't expected, it ended up creating this situation. So what we decided to do was create an international jihad, a holy war against the Russians, and the creation of the Mujahideen, who the CIA trained up and armed. And then once the war was over, we didn't do anything to break this group down, and we let Pakistan take over and radicalize them. The result of that was Al-Qaeda, and of course the follow-on to 9/11. So we just decided to kind of hope for the best, and this is the result we get. Well, let's talk a little bit about Iraq. Well, one of the things that happens when Iraq pulls up to the borders of Kuwait is our ambassador to Iraq was asked point blank, what's the United States position on the dispute between Iraq and Kuwait? And she said it was none of our business. Now, that could have been just a complete isolated idiocy on the ambassador's part, or that may have been U.S. policy. But the result ends up being, regardless, that Iraq invades Kuwait. Then we basically create 10 years of instability in the region with a weakened Saddam government. And then in 2002, we lie about weapons of mass destruction and Al-Qaeda links, and we end up taking down the country. Now, this is an interesting picture here because this is the famous picture of the statue being torn down. This started with a single Iraqi pounding on it with a sledgehammer, and what ended up happening is the Americans came in and helped finish the job. This guy, the guy who started it, was interviewed 10 years later, and he deeply regrets starting the removal of the statue. He says, instead of one Saddam, we now have 1,000. So, how are things going in Ukraine? Well, when things started going downhill there in the Donbass region, the CIA moved in and trained the Azov Brigade, which are neo-Nazis. There are a lot of reports out there that international right-wing organizations were sending people in there the entire time and getting additional training and weapons. So we may have sent radicalized Nazi and fascist-like groups from around the world and trained them and armed them. So we've probably destabilized the entire planet with this. We actively backed a peace process between Russia and Ukraine that we knew was going to fail. The plan was merely to add a couple of years to Ukraine to give them more chance to build up their military. And then we were actively involved in the overthrow of a Russian-backed government in Ukraine to replace it with a pro-Western government, which immediately resulted in the seizure of Crimea. During the same time period, we openly offered NATO membership to Ukraine. The details weren't hammered out. This was something Bush did, where he wanted Ukraine and Georgia brought into NATO. And so basically the door was opened. Russia made it very clear that Ukraine entering NATO was a red line that they would not tolerate. So basically, they warned us they would declare war, and we moved forward with it anyway. So part of the reason why they seized Crimea and they stirred up the separatists in the Donbass was for the purpose of creating a situation where Ukraine had disputed borders, which would make it ineligible to join Ukraine. So now we're at the point where we're playing foreign policy games, poking around with a nuclear armed nation. A nation that has more nuclear weapons than anyone on the planet, nuclear weapons that we have no capability of shooting down. Now, initially, when this all started, it was like, oh, well, all we're going to do is provide them small arms and ammunition, nothing else. And then it's like, oh, well, we're going to give them artillery too, and nothing else. That's the line. We're going to draw the line there. Then we were told, oh, well, we're going to give them short-range rockets. We're never going to give them anything that they could shoot over the borders with. And we sent in the HMIRS systems, which are long-range. And then we told them, well, we're never going to put main battle tanks in there. And now we're in the process. We strong-armed Germany into sending Leopards over there, and we're in the process of transferring M1 Abrams over there. And now the new red line we're working on is F-16s, which we said initially we would never ever give to them, but we're in the process of training Ukrainian pilots to fly. So if you can see what's going on here, they're creating these lines to make it look like they're rational to the American people. And then they like reluctantly cross the line, and it's kind of the old boiling the frog argument. They're basically making it seem like they're restrained and then reluctantly crossing these lines and then drawing a new line saying, okay, we're never going to cross that one, so don't worry. And so it gets people used to the idea of, well, yeah, we're not really escalating because we really didn't mean to. But I think it's important, even if you support Ukraine, to come out with two conclusions from our foreign policy history. One is they're never right. They haven't been right in any foreign policy situation we've gone into. And the other thing is they never tell the truth. What they're saying in the open isn't what's really happening. Ultimately, you have to look at our foreign policy decision makers are essentially the worst of the worst. These are people who believe they're incredibly intelligent and they're incapable of seeing their own intellectual limitations. So they're absolutely, with total confidence, making these decisions, not exactly knowing what the outcome's going to be. And they have a brutal arrogance where they can't admit their failures when they've had them. They just basically wallpaper over history and say, oh yeah, that's kind of what we meant to have happen. So we're in a dangerous situation where if this keeps escalating, the results could be nuclear war. There are ways out of this. It can be negotiated, and negotiations means compromise. Compromise means nobody's happy on either side. Right now, we have no end goal for this war that's being enunciated to the American public. Maybe there's one behind the closed doors for the policymakers, but they're not telling us what it is. If you have no end goal, there's no way out. Then you end up with things like being stuck in Iraq for 10 years or stuck in Afghanistan for 20 years. This war, so the way things are going, this war at its worst is something we're stuck with for a long, long time to come, which is an incredible drain on our economy. But at the worst, this may be a hideous miscalculation that brings us a war that we thought stopped being possible in 1990. So I urge you to get hold of your congressman. Again, I put the links in the comment section. Very easy to get hold of them. You enter your zip code, and if you have you'll get your senators, enter your zip code and probably your address if you have a split. If you have multiple districts going through your zip code, and you'll get your representative. And just a short message. It doesn't have to be anything long and eloquent. Just say, I oppose the activation of reserves. I demand we start looking for some negotiated settlement for this immediately. All right, and I'll try not to make a habit of these calls for action because I know they're probably not as interesting as talking about current events or media events. So please comment below. Were you aware that the reserves are being called up? Do you see these reserve call-ups as being a type of trial balloon? What do you think the reserve call-ups mean in terms of how things are going with the Ukrainian war? If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please consider subscribing. Look at my other titles. You'll see I have a broad range of interests. I'm sure I've talked about something that'll interest you. Please smash the like button, and if you think someone will find this video interesting, please share it with them. Thanks for spending time with me. Hope to see you again in a future video.